Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2025 the Grand Swiss. This year's FIDE Grand Swiss was a truly spectacular and thrilling event. This is one of the highest and strongest tournament of the year with 200, nearly 300 players participating from different countries, but all having extremely strong skills. And this whole tournament, another incredible thing about it is that they are just incredibly tough for many of the players. All of the players, the stakes were higher than ever. And because only the top two finishers they get to qualify into the one and only the candidates tournament. And if you win the candidates, then you'll be able to challenge the world champion, who is right now Gukesh Damaraju. And for the top two, which means that you have to perform extremely well. And there are many stories worth for us to share, definitely. But one of the most particular stories which have drawn a lot of attention recently is the story about Alireza Firouzja, who is the third place of this event. Now, what happened to him? Well, Firouzja, he finished with the same points or score as the second place Matthias Blubaum from Germany, who at the very end, since had a higher tiebreak, eventually came to second place and qualified into the candidates, which for him was an extremely incredible performance for this whole Grand Swiss. And they both scored 7.5 points out of 11. But when players they tie, they have equal scores, then the tie breaks come into play. This whole system, in this case, however, the average player rating of your opponents, with the lowest rated player not really removed, then you just decide the final ranking after calculating the average rating of your opponent. At the very end, Blubaum had a higher average opponent rating than Firouzja did, which Blubaum had the average tiebreak score of 26.95 rating, whereas for Firouzja had a 26.84, just only 11 points gap difference. A very slight difference, but enough for Blubaum to come to second place and send him to the candidates. And it was really unfortunate for Firouzja, who finished third, missing out on qualification. And what added even more drama to this whole story is that the closing ceremony. And we can see Blubaum and Anish Giri, they were there for the ceremony, but unfortunately Firouzja was missing. And this sparked a heated discussion among fans. And many believe that he just this was a quiet silent protest against the tiebreak rule or something, though of course that is just some opinions and speculations. But none of that doesn't matter now. Either way, this moment has become one of the most attractive stories of the 2025 Grand Swiss, and highlighting just how cruel and hard it is for you to qualify for the candidates. Now here, as we can see, there are even some news that is related to the tiebreak rule about the Grand Swiss after it has finished. And even here we have the 5 times world champion Magnus Carlsen saying that it has to be said that it's incredibly cruel to decide the candidate spots by tiebreaks as they do. So definitely it can be another way to figure out who is this second place with playoffs. But unfortunately, that Firouzja is third place, and Blubaum played really nice, had a higher tiebreak, and he is second place. But also for first place Anish Giri, he himself also had an excellent event. And today actually we're going to be taking a look at one of the games that he has played, which is the final game against Hans Niemann. Well, there's definitely a lot of things that we can learn from the champion, and here he is with the white pieces in the final round. Both himself and Hans are in a must-win situation. And as for Firouzja and Blue Bomb, they are playing against each other in the very last round as well, though that game ended in a draw. Alright, but now let's put our focus back onto this very last game of the whole round, and this is a very important game deciding the champion. Giri starts with the move c4 and knight f6, knight c3, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Here we have the English opening, the four knights, the quiet line in this case. Bishop b4, queen c2, bishop takes c3, and here queen takes c3, queen e7. For Anish, he is actually playing out these moves really fast, whereas for Hans, he has started to think already actually from the very beginning. Like, he has been thinking for some time every each move, queen e7, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't know how to play this opening. He definitely knows, but is just probably trying to figure out how to find a more aggressive variation, because he is also in a must-win situation. Here a3, and then we have d5, d4, he takes d4, and knight takes d4, of course, takes, queen takes. We have some exchanges happening. c5 was played. Now, this move is a slight, well, not like an inaccuracy, but not the best variation here for black. It is slightly calmer for black to just decide to go short castle, finish his development, bring his king to safety, and then probably like to eventually play rook d8 and to develop the bishop. But instead, of course, Hans probably is really looking forward to win, and he plays the move c5, even though it attacks the queen, gains tempo, but also at the same time, you should know that pushing a pawn in general, every time you push a pawn, you should be extremely careful about that, because pawns can never go back and it can cause weaknesses in your own territory. So here, queen goes to h4, bishop e6, and here Hans spent like 22 minutes thinking. Already it is into an unfamiliar field for him. Bishop e6 is fine. Also, you can play d takes c4, up to you. But here he played bishop e6. Anish here spent 2 minutes thinking with c takes d5, which is the best and only move to keep the initiative. Knight takes d5, bishop b5 check, bishop goes back, queen takes, knight takes, and now we're into an endgame, bishop e2, where now the queens are off the board at a very early stage of the game, only 15 moves. And here Anish, in the interview or in the recap of the game, he himself said that he is now in a position where he is definitely slightly better. It's not like completely winning or like immediately winning for him, that's for sure. And with accurate play, it might have just been a draw because the pawn structure and also the pieces are not that enough to create any like chaos. But here, the compensation or the reason that he is slightly better is the fact that white, first of all, has the bishop pair, but also black's pawn on the queen side is somehow a little bit floating. The c5 pawn has been pushed, and it can only be defended with b6. But in the future, white always have some b4 ideas to break open up, some diagonals for these two bishops. And also, very importantly, black has a knight, but in this case, the knight doesn't have a very strong square to stand on. So here, white is slightly better with some positional advantage, and of course, it is worth for Giri to keep on playing. Hans here plays rook c8, f3 was played, f6, king f2. So both sides, they are putting their king to a better scope and also lining up their rooks. Rook d1, bishop e6, h4. So here, maybe it is slightly better for Giri to play e4 instead, because it opens up the diagonal for the bishop and also controls these very important light squares in black's territory, like preventing black from ever jumping to these squares. And this pawn structure is quite solid for white. Maybe there are some f5 ideas, but in this position, it's simply like white can just ignore it and develop with bishop e3. If you take, then after take, it's probably unclear for white. Anish, he definitely saw this whole variation, but it's hard to evaluate what really will happen after the change of the pawn structure. But it turns out that white's position is in the computer's favor here a lot. But however, in the game, Anish instead plays the move h4 with a more simple idea of gaining more space on the king side, pushing probably g4, g5 to put pressure. And here Hans plays the move b6. Although it is probably better for him to keep on maneuvering his minor pieces, especially this knight to knight c6, maybe knight e5 ideas or knight a5 ideas, or he can also play rook hd8, for example, to trade off a pair of rooks and to gain control of the d file. But instead here he plays the move b6, which also looks quite logical to support the c5 pawn, but here unfortunately it loses some time for black, and here Anish finds the best time and plays the move e4. Knight c6, with the idea of jumping to d4 and creating some counterplay. Bishop e3, preventing the idea of knight d4. Knight a5 coming, trying to jump for these light squares. And here Anish, he plays the move rook d6, which was given a question mark here, but here probably a more accurate approach is to simply develop with rook ac1. Of course, there's sometimes a slight difference between these positional moves, and rook d6 seems quite reasonable. And Hans here plays rook e8. Of course, it's not that easy to see why this rook d6 move is not good, but the reason for that is, well, it is actually better for black to play rook hd8 to offer a trade of rooks. And for example, if you want to wait for black to take, then after takes, and then here king e7, black gets to attack the rook goes back, for example, and here the knight jumps in, and it will be most likely for black to hold a draw here. But once again, sometimes you cannot just look at the position and evaluate and calculate everything. Sometimes there are some outside reasons for your play. And here both sides, again, they're in a must-win situation, and Hans is playing desperately for counterplay to win. And here he plays the move rook e8, avoiding any trade so far, g4. But of course, Anish is also looking for his chance on the king side with the pawns knight b7 back, rook goes back, knight a5. But it seems that Hans here is lacking some ideas. Rook d6 back, and there is some repetition happening, but finally here Anish, he avoided the repetition and placed the rook all the way back to d1. Here knight a5 was once played again, but here rook ac1, and Anish finally fixed this problem with rook d6. The main difference is that the black rook is now on e8, but it's not much of a difference. Rook e1 right now out, and there might be some b4 ideas coming. Let's see what black does. And here already, Hans made a mistake with king e7, but again, it just simply loses time on the spot. What he needs to play here is jump directly into the position with knight b3, and after rook c3, which is kind of the only move, here to play c4. Even though white is still quite better, but black here with some ideas of pushing the pawns on the queen side and the knight very strong and solid on the b3 square, I think black will have compensation and might be enough to hold a draw. But here Hans instead plays the move king e7, maybe with the idea of preventing any rook d6 coming, but it is completely unnecessary here and gives Anish the chance to go straight in directly. Here probably g5 is better, but it creates counterplay and opens up files directly on the king side. But instead, Anish here plays bishop a6, attacking the rook, which is also fine. Rook c d8, takes. Even though black has the open d file, which is the only open file in the position, but really the rook cannot go into any of these squares because it will just get taken. So the d file is basically right now useless for both sides. And here Anish plays for the move b4, opening up a new file with the c file. And here knight b3 was played, but rook c3, rook d6, and after takes, b takes c5. The best move here is to take with the knight, and after here, well, if you take, then after takes, this will just most likely be a draw. So after knight takes, probably it is better for white to move this bishop away with bishop b5 and then threatening to take. But of course, at this point, it will be easier for black to hold the draw. And here we reach a very important position of this whole game. Right now, basically, Anish has two choices, which are both moves that clearly shows that he is still better. One is to go back with bishop e2 or bishop b5. It doesn't matter. The bishop just goes back and you keep the bishop pair on the board. Bishop pair versus bishop and knight. And you keep on playing. But the position is quite complicated if you do that. And the other option here is to play rook takes b3, which is also very attracting. Because after takes, you take with the bishop and you win the rook back and you're up a pawn in the same color bishop endgame, which at that point you'll have a position where you can never lose, of course. But in the game here, Anish, he decided to go for this approach with the move rook b3, bishop c5. And he said in an interview that obviously he knows that both options he'll not lose. And he is better, of course, at that point. But if he missed a win with bishop e2 or bishop b5, he can forgive himself because the position is still quite complex with the knight and the pawns on the board, and there are some counterplay for black. But if he just made a draw, or he just lost a point with he missed a win, actually, in that point. If he missed a win with rook b3, he will never forgive himself, because after takes, at this point, if, for example, he thought that this was a draw, but after the game he analyzed it and found that it was a win, then it will be so unfortunate, because if this was a win, then it is going to be a very easy one, because into an same colored endgame, bishop endgame, with some techniques, it will be very easy for you to win with a pawn up. So he decided to go for this simplification of the position. And here after king d7, which was an inaccuracy, a mistake by Hans. Here the only move but a quite computer-like move to play the move h6, but already it's hard to give a reason why to play this move and why the computer suggests this move. So already it is really hard for black to defend at this point. And here Hans plays the very logical move king d7. And after we reach this endgame, Giri, he eventually played this move g5, the best move to keep the advantage. And this also shows how strong his endgame techniques are. Bishop e6, he goes up with the king, and now he is putting his king to the very nice square on f4. King d4, but can Hans save the game? Well, unfortunately no, because after g takes f6, a4, first of all, this pawn gets pushed really high up the board. Bishop d7, bishop e2, and the pawn pushes all the way up the board. Because here, if you take, it doesn't really help. The f pawn just keeps pushing, but allowing the pawn to take on f6, even though the king can go back. But now after f7, you take, and now the king goes up. The idea of pushing the pawn and giving these checks are unstoppable. And with that, Hans here already, he can play a couple of more moves, just waiting back and forth. But of course, he is still gonna lose this whole game. So here he resigned at this very specific position, and with that, Anish Giri wins the 2025 Grand Swiss. Well, actually, when this game has ended, the game round number board 2, where Firouzja is playing against Blue Bomb, their game is still going on, but it ended in a draw pretty soon. And with that, Anish Giri officially is the champion of the 2025 Grand Swiss. And this final game by him was extremely nice, and there are some slight mistakes like rook d6 or something, but he finished it off really cleanly at the very end. And with that, he is the champion. And for Matthias Bluebomb, second place. For Firouzja, a little bit unfortunate due to the slightly lower tie breaks, but yeah. Alright, so congratulations to Anish Giri and Matthias Bluebomb to qualify for the 2026 candidates, and hope you guys enjoyed my recap of this game as well as this whole video, and thank you for watching. Please subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!